I had never thought of myself as the sort of man who could be shaken by a fleeting glance, yet that afternoon changed something in me. My life until then was predictable, perhaps even enviable from the outside. I had a steady job, a wife who had stood by me for years, and a daily rhythm that left little room for surprises. Still, beneath the surface of that well-ordered life was a restlessness I rarely admitted, even to myself. My marriage was stable, though not vibrant. My wife and I had grown into quiet companions rather than passionate lovers. Most evenings were filled with silence punctuated by practical conversations about bills, groceries, or work schedules. Nothing was wrong in the obvious sense, but nothing felt alive either. I often caught myself remembering the reckless spark of our early years, the way her laughter used to fill the room, the way I used to feel when she brushed against me by accident. That fire had cooled, replaced by routine. It was during one of those mundane days that I noticed her. She was not someone extraordinary at first glance, certainly not in the way that novels or films describe. But there was something about her energy, a brightness in her voice, that contrasted sharply with the muted tones of my own household. She was a colleague, technically speaking, though not one I worked closely with. I had seen her around before, exchanging polite nods or the occasional comment at meetings, but I had never paid her more attention than anyone else. That day, she stopped by my desk with a small stack of documents. Nothing unusual. She leaned over slightly as she pointed to a signature line I had overlooked. The motion was ordinary, uncalculated, and yet it changed the air around us. Her blouse slipped forward as she bent down, revealing just enough to make my face burn before I could look away. The heat rose to my cheeks so suddenly I felt exposed, as though every colleague in the room could see my reaction. My pulse quickened. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to focus on the papers in front of me. She didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she was kind enough not to show it. Her voice carried on lightly, explaining the details with professional ease, while I fought to steady my thoughts. It wasn't the neckline itself that unsettled me. It was my response, the involuntary jolt, the undeniable rush of awareness. I had not felt that way in years, not even with my wife. The realization embarrassed me. What sort of man blushes like a boy at something so trivial? And yet, the more I tried to dismiss it, the more it lingered. After she left, I sat frozen for several moments. The documents blurred before my eyes. My mind replayed the scene with merciless clarity, the curve of her collar, the warmth of her perfume, the unintentional intimacy of her nearness. I shook my head, ashamed, but the image refused to fade. I told myself it was nothing. Just a lapse, an instinctive reaction, as natural as hunger or thirst. Still, the weight of it pressed down on me, whispering questions I didn't want to answer. Why had it struck me so deeply? Was it simply because she was new, vibrant, different from the woman waiting at home? Or was it because some hollow inside me had been quietly demanding to be filled, and I hadn't noticed until that very moment? That night, sitting at the dinner table across from my wife, I found myself distracted. She asked about my day, and I muttered something vague, unwilling to admit the truth even in passing. She nodded, absorbed in her own thoughts, and I realized how wide the gulf between us had grown. We were together, yet each of us lived in separate worlds. And so the incident stayed with me, sharper than I expected, a silent marker of change. It was not love, not even real desire, at least not yet. But it was a crack in the armor I had worn for years, a reminder that temptation could slip through the smallest opening. I knew, with a clarity that unsettled me, that this was not the end of the story. Something had begun, and whether I wanted it or not, I would have to face what came next. The days that followed should have blurred into routine, as they always did. Yet they didn't. I caught myself scanning the office unconsciously, ears pricking at the sound of her laugh, eyes drawn to her movement across the room. Each time I told myself I was only noticing because of that single, embarrassing moment, but deep down I knew better. Something inside me had stirred awake, and once awake it refused to return to silence. I tried to rationalize. Attraction is harmless, I told myself. It's instinct, nothing more. I repeated this mantra when I caught my gaze drifting, when her perfume lingered faintly in the hallway, when she leaned against a desk in casual conversation with someone else. My shame was not so much about her, but about me, the weakness, the curiosity that felt uncomfortably close to betrayal. At home, my wife seemed unchanged, which only made me feel the difference more acutely. She was gentle, caring in her own quiet way, but preoccupied. Her work demanded long hours, and when she was home her energy was drained. I tried to spark conversations, but they fizzled out quickly, both of us retreating into our screens or books. Each silence stretched longer than the last. I did not blame her, but the absence of warmth created a space where my thoughts about the other woman began to thrive. It was during a late afternoon, after most of the office had emptied, that temptation tested me again. I was gathering my things when I heard her voice. "Still here?" she asked, stepping lightly into the room. I glanced up, startled, and tried to sound casual. "Just finishing up." "You?" "Same." She smiled, and for a moment the silence that followed was more intimate than any words could have been. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, casting the room in a half-shadow that seemed to draw us closer without either of us moving. She set her bag on the desk across from mine and began leafing through some papers. Our conversation wandered easily, work frustrations, small jokes, fragments of personal life. Her laughter was unguarded, warm, the sort of sound that made the corners of my chest ache. Each detail she revealed about herself, no matter how ordinary, felt like an invitation to know her more deeply. When she brushed past me to reach for a folder, her hand grazed mine. The contact lasted no more than a second, yet my body reacted as though struck by lightning. I froze, afraid to move, afraid she would notice the sudden tremor in my breath. She didn't mention it, though her eyes lingered on mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary. After that, every interaction carried an undercurrent I could not ignore. In meetings, our eyes met more often than they should have. When she spoke to me, her tone softened, almost conspiratorial. I began to anticipate these moments, to crave them in the way one craves the warmth of sunlight after weeks of rain. But with every step closer, guilt gnawed at me. At night I lay awake beside my wife, her steady breathing a reminder of the vows I had made, of the trust I was threatening to fracture. I told myself again and again that I had done nothing wrong, that these were only thoughts. Yet thoughts, I knew, were seeds, and seeds could grow into something impossible to contain. The temptation reached its peak one evening when we were the last to leave after a long project deadline. She leaned against the doorway as I packed my bag, her expression playful. "You work too hard," she teased. "And you don't," I replied, my voice sounding rougher than I intended. Her smile lingered, then faded into something quieter, more searching. The room fell silent. I could hear the hum of the lights, the distant murmur of traffic outside. For a moment, the space between us felt fragile, like a thread pulled tight and ready to snap. I imagined stepping forward, imagined the heat of her body close to mine. But I didn't move. I forced myself to look away, to sling the bag over my shoulder and break the moment. "See you tomorrow," I said, the words escaping like a lifeline. She hesitated, then nodded. "Good night." As I walked out, my pulse still racing, I knew the danger was no longer abstract. This was not a passing attraction. It was something alive, something that pressed against the edges of my self-control. I had avoided crossing the line tonight, but I also understood with chilling certainty, there would be another night, another test. And I was no longer sure how many times I could resist. I had always believed that temptation could be kept at arm's length if one simply willed it so. That illusion shattered the night we finally crossed the line. It began innocently, as such things always do. We had stayed late again, working side by side in the quiet hum of an office emptied of everyone else. The only light came from the desk lamps, throwing long shadows across the walls. I told myself it was just another long evening, another harmless stretch of shared time. Yet beneath that surface normalcy, I felt the steady current of something stronger, something pulling us both toward a shore we had tried not to see. She was the one who broke the silence first. "Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions?" Her voice was low, almost tentative, as though she feared the answer. The question struck deeper than I expected. My throat tightened. "All the time," I admitted, before I could censor myself. Our eyes met, and in that look was an unspoken acknowledgement, two people who had been carrying quiet dissatisfaction, who had been starved of attention they could no longer ignore. The space between us seemed to shrink. When her hand brushed mine, I didn't pull away this time. The touch lingered, deliberate, sending heat rushing through me. I knew what it meant. I knew where it led. But I also knew I didn't want to let go. She stepped closer, her presence filling the small circle of light around us. My heart pounded so loudly I wondered if she could hear it. For a long moment, neither of us moved, suspended between decision and restraint. Then, slowly, as if guided by some force larger than us both, I leaned in. Our lips met, soft at first, tentative, almost questioning. Then the kiss deepened, a flood of everything we had restrained spilling over in an instant. My hands trembled as they found her shoulders, her fingers tightened against my arm. The world outside that moment ceased to exist. And yet, even as desire surged, guilt struck like a knife. I saw flashes of my wife's smile, the quiet dinners at home, the trust she had given me without hesitation. The weight of betrayal pressed down, but the heat of the moment drowned it out. I hated myself for not stopping, and still, I didn't stop. When at last we pulled away, the silence was heavier than before. She looked at me, her expression unreadable, a mix of longing, fear, and regret. "We shouldn't have," she whispered. "I know," I replied, my voice hoarse. My chest ached with conflicting truths, the thrill of being wanted, the shame of being unfaithful. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The office seemed colder, emptier, as though it knew what had just transpired. I wanted to say something that would make sense of it, but no words came. All I could feel was the thundering echo of my own heartbeat and the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. As we gathered our things, our movements were stiff, mechanical. We didn't look at each other directly. The easy laughter we had once shared was gone, replaced by a fragile tension that clung to us like smoke after a fire. Walking out into the night air, I felt both exhilarated and hollow. I had crossed a boundary I once believed sacred. No excuse could erase the truth. I had betrayed the woman waiting at home for me, the life I had built, the man I thought I was. And yet, despite the shame, part of me already craved more. That contradiction was perhaps the most human part of it all, the ability to know something is wrong and still long for it with every fiber of your being. As I drove home, her taste lingered on my lips, her touch burned against my skin. The guilt coiled tighter with every mile, but so did the memory of how alive I had felt in her arms. When I finally stepped through my front door, my wife greeted me with a weary smile. "Long day?" she asked. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice steady. "Yeah, very long." She turned back to the stove, stirring a pot of soup as if nothing in the world had changed. But I knew differently. I had crossed the threshold, and there was no way back to the man I had been only hours before. The days after felt strangely unreal, as if I were moving through a fog no one else could see. Outwardly, nothing had changed. I went to work, came home, shared meals with my wife. But inside, the ground had shifted. Every glance in the mirror reminded me of the secret I now carried, the hidden fracture no one else could detect. At the office, she and I avoided each other at first, speaking only when absolutely necessary. The memory of that night hovered in the air, pressing down on us whenever our eyes met. I could sense the same conflict in her, the pull of desire entangled with the weight of regret. We had stepped too far to pretend it hadn't happened, yet neither of us dared to acknowledge it aloud. At home, my wife remained oblivious. She greeted me with her usual tired smile, placed dinner on the table, asked routine questions. But I could no longer meet her gaze for long. Each word from her lips seemed to echo in the space between us: trust, loyalty, love. Words I had betrayed. The guilt gnawed at me, sharper than any hunger. Lying awake at night, I replayed everything: the first accidental glance, the brush of her hand, the moment I leaned in and surrendered. Each memory was a blade, cutting deeper with every pass. And yet, alongside the guilt, there remained a quiet longing, a hunger for that fleeting rush of life I had felt in her arms. That was the cruelest part of all, to want what I despised myself for. I began to notice the small things about my wife again, though this time through the lens of guilt. The way she hummed softly while cooking. The crease on her forehead when she read late at night. The tenderness in her voice when she reminded me not to overwork myself. These details, once buried beneath routine, resurfaced like treasures I had forgotten to value. And each one cut me deeper. I realized, with a clarity that felt almost merciless, that the problem had never been her. It was me, my restlessness, my weakness, my inability to sit with the quietness of commitment. Temptation had not appeared because love was gone, it had appeared because I had stopped choosing it. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, she asked without looking up, "You've been distant lately. Is everything all right?" Her words hit like a hammer. I nearly confessed everything then and there. The truth clawed at my throat, demanding release. But in the end, I swallowed it back. A confession would not heal, it would destroy. I had already broken something between us, I would not shatter the rest by unloading my guilt onto her shoulders. Instead, I reached for her hand across the table. She looked up, surprised, as though the gesture was unfamiliar after so many years. "I'm fine," I said softly. "Just tired. But I'm here." Her fingers tightened around mine. A simple squeeze, small but steady. And in that moment, I understood that redemption was not about grand confessions or dramatic gestures. It was about the daily choice to stay, to hold on, to nurture what I had nearly thrown away. The memory of the other woman did not vanish. It lingered, as all temptations do, a scar etched into the fabric of my conscience. But scars can serve as warnings. Every time I thought of her, of the line I had crossed, I reminded myself of the cost. I reminded myself of the woman sitting across from me, the one who had given me her years, her trust, her quiet devotion. I cannot claim purity anymore. That part of me is gone. What remains is something more complicated, the knowledge of my own weakness, and the deliberate choice to fight it. Perhaps that, in its own flawed way, is also human, to fall, to stumble, and still to rise again, carrying the weight of our mistakes as we move forward. When I look back on that first moment, when she bent down and my face flushed red, I see it now as the opening of a door I should have kept closed. I stepped through, and I paid the price. The lesson is etched into me. Temptation will always whisper, but loyalty must be chosen again and again, even when the fire of passion has dimmed. That is the truth of my story. Not that I was tempted, not even that I failed, but that I learned what it means to be human, fragile, flawed, yet still capable of choosing love despite the cracks.